Welcome to the Grazing Grass Podcast, episode 56.
You're a grass farmer before you're a livestock farmer, so you have to take care of your grass. If your grass is not in good health, your cows aren't going to benefit from it.
You're listening to the Grazing Grass Podcast, helping grass farmers learn from grass farmers. And every episode features a grass farmer and their operation. I'm your host, Cal Hardage. On today's episode, we have Claudia Kaelin from Canada on to discuss grass-fed beef, turkeys, pork, and some goats in there. In fact, we talk about boar goats and then Limousin cattle in the overgrazing section. She is our first guest from Canada, so very excited about that. And I think we have an excellent episode you'll enjoy. However, before we talk to Claudia, 10 seconds about my farm. So I told you last week, got home from the grazing conference. It motivated me to do some daily moves, and I've been semi-successful with that. I'm really moving more like every other day, but I am moving the cattle. I did get a teeler farm gate that I plan on getting to work tomorrow. And also I purchased a couple more South Pole cows for the farm. So I'm excited to increase the South Pole numbers, and it's been raining, not as much as I want, but we're getting some rain, so that's really great. And there's been some areas around me that's been very dry that's gotten more rain than I have. So that is excellent news for them. But enough about me. Let's talk to Claudia. Claudia, we want to welcome you to the Grazing Grass Podcast. We're excited you're here today.
Thank you for having me, Cal.
Claudia, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your operation?
So my name's Claudia. I was originally born in Switzerland, and then our family moved to Canada in 1998 when I was 5 months old. We've been farming here ever since. So I'm from St. Pascal Bailon. That's in Eastern Ontario, Canada. It's about an hour out of Ottawa and an hour and a half from Montreal. So we're right in between there. We started with dairy, and then we gradually moved to cash cropping. And then when I graduated high school, I went off to McGill University and studied in farm management and technology. And then I came back to the farm, and here I am.
Very good. And when did your family has crops.
Yeah.
Did they have cattle or any other livestock at the time when you came back from school?
So we had dairy animals at the beginning until 2003, and then they sold the dairy to focus on the crops. After they sold the dairy cows, they kind of missed having animals around, so they bought some Charolais beef, and so we had those for a while. But then they kind of weaned down the amount of animals they had, and then so I went to college, and when I came back, we still had a couple cows, two cows and a heifer. So that's what I started working with.
And what were your goals there when you started working with the cattle?
Well, at the beginning, I just wanted to feed our own family. I was like, well, we have beef, eat our own beef. So because we do crops, so most of our land is for corn, beans, wheat. That's what we do. But then like right where our farm is, we have this marginal land. It's just bedrock. So we're on a rocky ridge, and that's where the farm name comes from. So Fossil Ridge Farm. And this rocky outcrop is like a little island in the sea of like good farmland. And it's just, you can't do anything with it. So I was like, this is the perfect opportunity to graze and try and make something of this essentially useless land into something useful. And so that's how that started.
Very good. And that was, you came back to the farm 2016, 2018?
I finished college in 2016, and then I worked a year at a different farm. And so I came back to the farm in 2017.
So once you came back to the farm and you started down this path to provide beef for yourself, were you thinking at the time grass-fed, or what was your thought pattern there, and where did you start towards the grass-fed?
I have a lot of influence from my parents and my dad. We grow crops. So he's like, feed corn. And I was like, okay, because when we when we process our corn in the fall, we have corn fines, and it's a waste product, essentially. It's basically just cracked kernels, so it's perfectly fine. It's just,
Oh,
you
yes.
can't really sell it. So my dad's like, we have an abundance of this, just feed it. And I was like, okay, but I wasn't happy with how my animals were doing when I was doing that, because, I started to have some bottle calves to raise in the first year alongside the other ones. And those bottle calves, they were getting some of those corn fines, and I had some develop acidosis, and then their feet were sore and they couldn't walk. So I was
Oh,
like,
yes.
I don't want to do this. I don't want them to not be able to walk. So I was like, no. Let's just stick to grass fed only. Like, I don't need to mess around. And with the beef cows, the forage we have, like, they almost get fat off of it anyways. I don't need to give them anything extra.
When is your first and last frost, so our listeners can get an idea of your growing season?
Yeah. So typically our last frost is at the end of April, beginning of May. Sometimes we have one later in May, which occasionally happens. Last year we had that, and it was not great for a lot of people. And then our last frost is typically at the end of September, beginning of November, but we prefer it to be later, obviously. And so that leaves us with a very short growing season and a very long winter.
Oh, yes. So what kind of forages are you growing there for your animals?
Yeah, so we have most of the regular stuff you can think of. So we have orchard grass, Kentucky blue, fescues, timothy. We have red and white clover, and we also have some native grasses. Pretty much what most people are familiar with.
How warm does it get during the summer, and how cold does it get during the winter?
So in the summer, it can get pretty warm. So typically it's around 25 to 25 degrees Celsius, 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And then sometimes we get up to 40 degrees Celsius, which is pretty hot. That's around 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And
okay.
It can get quite warm. And our region is humid. So like in the western parts of Canada, it's more dry. But
yes.
Where we are, it's very humid. So when it gets hot, you feel the heat. And when it gets cold, you feel the cold because it's like a humid cold. In the winter, it's typically around minus 25 degrees Celsius. And we can go all the way down to minus 40 degrees Celsius, which is also minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah, temperatures I don't like.
When I go out in the winter to take care of my cattle, I have 5 layers and I look like the Michelin Man,
Yes. Now, are your cattle on pasture during the winter, or what do you do with your cattle during the winter?
So we had the old dairy barn, and I was like, why not use the barn as a barn? So all the animals go there in the winter, and we basically have lockdown essentially. Everyone is inside except for the mother cows, which can go, they have a little yard outside, so they can go out and they do go outside, even when it's minus 40, minus 30, they're out there enjoying the sun. If it's sunny weather, if it's not sunny,
Yes.
They're all inside. But they do enjoy going outside. But for the most part, just because of the amount of snow we have, we keep them in the barn. It's just easier to manage with water and feed.
How much snow do you get in a year?
So typically, it's probably around 2 to 3 feet. And then in more snowy years, we can get all the way up to 6 feet of snow.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes we have a snow dump. We have 2 feet of snow in one night, and it's just, yeah.
Oh, yes. So you are able to, I think you said your last frost is sometime in May, usually, maybe early May.
Yeah.
So you out grazing now?
So in the spring, we are very muddy here. It starts to thaw around the beginning of April, but obviously our pastures are only starting to wake up. And then with all the snow thawing and melting, the ground gets hypersaturated. So we try to avoid taking them out until A, it's dry, and B, the grass has a certain amount of growth to it. We just put them out a day ago to the one pasture. We have 2 sacrificial pastures. We have the barnyard, and then we have the first sacrificial pasture. I'll put them on just to get them out of the mud. And then we have the second one to get them out of that one when it becomes muddy. And then from there, they move on into the main pastures.
So do you have them on a bedrock pasture now to start rotationally grazing them?
Yes. So they are on bedrock. So we have actually 2 groups. So I run half full-blood Limousins, and I run half like commercial cattle crosses. Usually, they're a bit Charlotte influenced. So we have two groups because I have an AI group and I have a natural service group. So I have a group out with the bull, and they're the ones that are out on the main rotation, and then I have the other ones which are on a separate rotation.
You've got two groups out. Are you able to do daily rotations? Or are you doing, what kind of rotations are you going and doing, and how's that going for you?
Yeah. So because of the difficulties of working, essentially trying to graze on rock, we're not doing daily rotations. Not at this point in the season and not in the pasture they are right now. The grass is too short, essentially, and the fencing is a big pain. What we do is we have mainly step-in posts because you can't put in a permanent fence. You can't dig a hole to put a cedar post in or anything. So we use step-in posts, and we just kind of try to, I stab at the ground until I feel a spot that doesn't go clink, clink, clink every time I try to put it down. You make it work, but it's almost the way it is set up right now. The paddock they're in, we can't really separate it into individual, like into smaller rotation paddocks. It's plans to do, but what we have to do is like, it would require like major management kind of overhaul, trying to like figure out how we can run those fences across that stone.
Oh, yes.
So we have a second paddock across the road. That's our bigger pasture. And there we kind of run it like a modified wagon wheel. And it's a bedrock outcrop, and it's got a bush on it. And so we leave them in there all the time. And so that's where their water is. We can't pull water lines through most of our pastures because we have essentially like you dig down maybe 18 inches and you're on bedrock, or some spots it's like a bald spot because it's just rock. Because we can't pull the water line in and it gets minus 30 degrees here in the winter, it has to be at least 3 feet deep, and we can't achieve that. So we have to put it where it has to be, and we can't move it anymore. So they stay there. And then what we have is we have little, I guess, spools or whatever you call that off to the side where we'll let them go in to graze.
Oh.
And then we'll close it back up and move them and open it up to the second one. So they can always come back to where the water is and where the bush is. That way they graze the area provided, which is black muck. So they actually have some growth on that spot, but they're able to eat the fresh grass, and they're able to go back in the bush and get shade, and they're able to browse in there. And the second part of that is we kind of want them to put a little more pressure on that area because it's a very wooded area, and we want them to kind of help open it up a little.
Oh, yes. So you've got centralized water there, and you mentioned wagon wheels, and you're using step-in posts and a single strand electrified fence.
So we use electric fence only because we can't put in the permanent one. Step-in posts, and what we have also developed is essentially we take a culvert. So when you do drainage, those drainage tubes, they come on this old, like a culvert that's usually its defective culvert. And so we take those and we cut them into about they're maybe a foot tall. So foot tall rings. And then we'll take a pipe and we'll put it in there and we'll fill it with cement. And then we have basically a post that's pretty solid, and we just place it in strategic areas to make corner posts, or like if we have a long fence line, we'll put it in the middle, and it'll just help keep that in place.
Very good. The bedrock really causes a dilemma there on your fence. And when I have a lease property that, whenever I go put in the step-in post, half the time I have to move it over because it hit a rock. But it's not continuous rock. It's just little limestone that's pieces that I can miss if I move over a foot. So it's much easier than what you're dealing with.
Yeah. Sometimes, like, if you're in a really bad spot, like it's just a solid rock. If it's a better spot, it's kind of like a cracked rock. So you can find, usually if you look on the ground and you see the grass, you'll see where the grass is taller. That's where the crack is. And that's where you try to aim your fence post. But I probably have the record of the most broken fence posts because when I try to go put them in, they just break on me.
Oh, yes. So I can see some challenges there with your bedrock. You've listed a couple already. putting your fences in presents its own challenges. Watering presents its own challenges, so you're using a centralized water system. What other challenges does that grazing bedrock present to you?
Yeah, so there's two main things, and that's the lack of organic matter means there is not very much nutrients available to the forages, and also we can't hold on to water. So when it rains, like we get around 30 inches of rain during the summer, but like the ground can't hold it. It'll soak in what it can, but the rest it's just gone.
Do you have any plans or any ideas how to increase that organic matter there for you?
Yeah, so we do fertilize for one. I know a lot of people, they might not like that, but we have to introduce nutrients to there. We don't really have much option, and you can only grow organic matter so fast. And if you're harvesting meat off of that, you have to replenish it somehow. And then the second thing is that what we're doing is we'll graze bales out. So if we'll have like a bald patch or a very shallow patch of soil, we'll put a bale down, and then whatever is essentially quote unquote waste is not wasted. It's going to create some organic matter there.
Oh, yes.
Some substance for the grass to grow on.
Right. That bale will give you some more carbon and get organic matter there, really build it up. Yeah. Takes a while though, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. But it works faster than if you don't do anything.
That is true. Yes. Yes. Now, in addition to cattle, you also have other species.
Yes, we raise boar goats, and we also raise hogs and turkeys.
You mentioned the bush there where your watering system are for the cows. Are you using your goats to graze that area, or?
Eventually, it's the plan. At this point, they're not quite out there yet with the cattle. I would like to have a flurd eventually. But at this point, like I just started with the goats in 2020, so I've only had them for 3 years, and I started with a small group. So I'm trying to increase my herd size. And the other thing is we do have a predator presence in our area, and I haven't been comfortable to remove them from, like, we have an area that has a permanent fence.
Oh, yes.
And that's usually where I run them, but I haven't been confident enough to put them outside that fenced area unless our male goats will do what we call pasture test. And I have it's a big crate it's like a big chicken tractor, but for goats. And I put my bucks in there and I pull that along, but it's enclosed, or I have an electric fence that I put on with it.
So similar to what Justin Rhodes has for some of his sheep.
Yeah, yeah.
And as you think about your goats in the future and liking to get them out there, are you thinking livestock guardian dogs or some kind of guardian animal will help, or what's your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I was looking into getting dogs or a dog, just because like we do have coyotes and they're pretty bold. I think they might be coy dogs, mixed breed.
Oh, yes.
I've been out, doing fencing, and I turn the corner and there's a coyote like 10 feet away from me. And it's looking at you and it's not thinking I'm going to run away. It's thinking, is this a potential meal? And I'm like, no. If it's staring at me like that, I don't know what it's going to try with a goat. So,
oh, yes.
So yeah, definitely before they go out, I want to have a livestock guardian dog there with them.
Are your turkeys out on pasture?
Yeah, so they're out too, and the same kind of chicken tractor style. I guess it's a turkey tractor. And then like they aren't right now. I just keep them close for the same reason as the goats. I keep them close to the main buildings and stuff where they're less likely to get predated on. I did lose one once, but he jumped the fence, so I probably kind of did that to himself.
Oh.
Eventually, my goal would be when we have the flurd, so I would run the herd in the front, and then I would run the turkeys in behind them, and hopefully, kind of help deter predators just by being around the bigger animals as well.
Now, you mentioned a turkey tractor. Is it completely enclosed, or are you using like electric netting, or can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so it's basically, it's similar to the goat tractor. It's like a crate.
Oh, yes.
And it pulls along, and then like when they're small, they're enclosed, and when they get a bit bigger, I have a fence that they can go out.
And how do you move that?
I pull it with either the gator or the tractor.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
because it sounded like it'd be a little heavy to move by hand.
They're both heavy duty and they kind of come like that. So like what happens if my parents, they buy an equipment. So these particular crates, they bought a new hay rake. And so it was shipped in in 2 crates. So I had 2 crates for me. And it was like,
oh, yes.
convenient. They're already built. I just had to modify them to be strong enough to be pulled around.
Oh, yes. Yeah, very good reuse of that material. What breed are you using for your turkeys?
Our turkeys are the miniature whites. I've raised everything from bronze to the bronze breast to commercial whites, heritage breeds. And I found that the miniatures are kind of the best of both worlds. They're a little more hardy than the commercial white. Like those ones, I've had them and they'll be standing in front of me and they'll have a heart attack and there goes a 30-pound bird. So the little ones, they're a little more hardy. And as well, the processor that I have available to me, they only do birds up to 20 pounds. It's easier for me to manage these birds because they don't get very big.
And when he processes them for you, is he processing them into whole bird packages? Or you doing part?
We get them packaged into whole birds. And my main market for them is Thanksgiving and Christmas. And then whatever we don't sell at Thanksgiving or Christmas, the rest gets made into sausages because it's too long around to the next Thanksgiving and not many people buy whole birds throughout the year. So it's just easier. And a lot of people actually love the turkey sausages.
And I think you have some different regulations to deal with than I would if I was raising turkeys. You have a quota you have to work with?
Yeah, so we have a quota system up here in Canada, and essentially what it does is you buy the right to produce a certain amount of animals, and that guarantees kind of the price you get for that animal. So, or for that product, milk and eggs are included in this. So if you're a dairy farmer, you have 50 kilos of quota. That means you can have 80 cows and you're always guaranteed your milk price is going to be stable. For turkeys, you're only allowed to raise 50 birds per year if you don't have quota. For chickens, you can raise up to 300 birds, no quota. For meat, you can have 99 laying hens before you need quota. And for milk, you can't have 1 milking cow.
Is there a quota on like goat milk or sheep milk?
No quota on sheep or goats. So that's open market. Usually people do sign contracts with processors though. Because there are still like regulations you have to follow and how you can process the milk and this and that. And it's usually easier when you just sell it directly to a processing plant.
Why did you choose turkeys as opposed to chickens?
I have raised meat bird, like the meat chickens, but I prefer the turkeys. They're just more social and they're more curious about walking around and going out and doing things. And maybe I just like turkeys better to eat as well.
I am a fan of turkey. I have not raised any, but it is something I talk about occasionally. Usually my wife says I have enough going on. But one of these days, I'm going to raise some turkeys.
What I don't like about them, though, is that they are very personable. So they're kind of like puppies.
Yes.
And they do recognize you and they do you come out to them and they see you and they come on over and they start talking to you and stuff. And so it is kind of hard from that perspective to send them. A chicken would be easier.
I would assume based upon your description, they're more similar to goats because goats have such personalities.
Yeah, exactly. So they're more like a ruminant in personality or like a pig. They're just more intelligent, I guess. That's what it comes down to.
In addition to the cattle, the goats, the turkeys, you also have pigs. Do you raise them on pasture or what? How do you raise your pigs?
I guess you could call it forested pastures. So we have another area of Bedrock that's more heavily infested by trees. I don't really want to say infested, but it hasn't. So I'm leasing this from the neighbor and the neighbor they don't really go there much because they don't live nearby. So It's kind of like been forgotten and, over all the storms we had and these storms, like trees have fallen and it's just overgrown. So they're in there and that's where I run them. try and help clear it up a bit, and eventually, hopefully, we can graze other animals on it. But before that, they really need to open it up more, and I'm using the pigs to do all the heavy work.
How's that going for you?
Pretty good. They're very good at clearing.
Now, do you have breeding stock, or are you just buying feeders and raising them?
I used to buy feeders, and I guess the common thing for a lot of people is the people that raise the feeders are usually retiring because they're older. They're older folks. And so I used to buy them from one person, and he retired, and then I started buying them from another guy, and he retired, and I started buying them from another guy, and he unfortunately passed away because he was an older gentleman. And then I bought some more from another person yet again. And then, I just wasn't happy with the quality of the animal that I was getting. So I was like, I'm going to do my own, because I don't want to always have to change who I'm getting them from, because you never know how their biosecurity standards are and what they could bring to your farm. So I just decided it's safer if I raise my own stock.
I watch a YouTube channel that In Your Direction. Now, how close to you, I'm not sure, because that's way away from here, but Pete from Just a Few Acres Farm. And he is struggling with the same issues on sourcing feeder pigs. So he's changing the direction, somewhat of his direction of his pig program, and breeding in some different breeding stock. He was raising some of his own and buying some. So he's changing it around for some of the same reasons that you brought up, just sourcing those feeder pigs with quality genetics that'll work.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I know Pete, I watch him too on YouTube. He's actually, I looked it up, he's about 5 hours south from me.
Oh, so, yes.
Closer to me than he is to you, that's for sure.
Yes, that's true. He's running Dexter cattle. He is doing rotational grazing, but he's working with that cold environment like you are. So there's some limitations where I'm trying to keep cattle on pasture 365 days of a year. That's a little bit harder for you all that far north. And something that I really like that Pete does that I would like to talk to him about, I see pastures getting short. And this is wherever I go, rather at the end of my driveway, the pasture's really short. It's my neighbor's pasture, but it's really short. But at times, you need to pull off of it and let it recover if you have to put your cattle up. And I know certain grazers are like, you shouldn't have a sacrificial paddock. But at times you do.
Yeah. Depending
on the operation and depending on where you're located. But Pete is really good about summer, if he's looking like he doesn't have enough grass, pulls his cattle up and he feeds them hay until that grass is able to catch up and get ahead of him, so that he's not out there hurting his pasture. And that's one thing I really think he does really well.
Yeah, exactly. So we do the same thing. So we suffer from drought, usually around end of July, August. We usually go into a drought period, and obviously with a stone, like there's nothing growing. So we take the cattle and they put them in a sacrificial area, and we just feed them, because if you keep them on there, they're always going to keep nipping at that grass, and it's just not going to be able to recover. If it goes dormant, and they just nip it flat, it's not helping the situation. And you have to think of it, you're a grass farmer before you're a livestock farmer. So you have to take care of your grass. If your grass is not in good health, your cows aren't going to benefit from it.
I completely agree. You've got to manage the grass, and then you're using the livestock to harvest the grass and turn it into your marketable product, whatever that may be. And you're doing a few different species there to get it there. Yeah, but your grass, without your grass, you can't produce the other.
Your soil is the pantry, the sun is the chef, and the grass is the stove you're cooking on. If your stove isn't working, you're not going to make anything.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, because all the ingredients are there in the soil, and you're putting it together. But if your stove's not doing anything, you can't produce that end product. One thing, you talked about a few different species there. Are you marketing meat from all those species directly to the consumer? And I know we talked just a touch about turkeys and taking them to the processor. But how are you marketing those products?
Yes. So my main market is directly to consumer. So I sell either at farmers market or people that have met me beforehand and they now purchase from me directly and word of mouth. And that's my main market. I used to do stockers, and when I got into cattle, I started with those two cows, and then I bought some bottle calves to start out a bit more, to grow to herd size. And then I bought some more cows because my dad was like, if you want to make money with cows, you got to have a bigger herd. Like, okay. So I bought more cows. So I had some Angus, I had some Herefords, and then I had my full blood Limousins. So I had a big herd and I had more animals than I could sell directly to people. So I was selling stockers, and I'll tell you, like, it's a bad market for stockers, even up here. I went to the local sale barn just for fun to see how it is. And essentially there's two guys there that are buying cattle. And the one guy deals mostly in Holstein crosses because we have a lot of dairy farms up here, and they'll AI to Angus or what.
Oh, yeah.
And so there's one guy who just buys that, and then the other guy buys everything else. So there's really no competition. And even when I sell directly to a feedlot, it's kind of like, oh, this breed is not necessarily sought after because they don't, quote unquote, they don't eat a lot, which to them, eating a lot of food essentially equates to gaining a lot of pounds, which is not necessarily truth. So I was selling a lot at the beginning to the auction market because I couldn't market everything directly. Mm-hmm. And so I really cut back on the amount of animals I had. So I let some animals go, and now I'm pretty much able to sell all of my animals directly to consumers. And so like at this point, because I'm able to do this, like an animal that before I would have lost money sending her to the auction, but now she's my most valuable animal because not only has she produced X amount of calves over her life, she's now also walking ground beef for me, which is my best seller. So now I took a product that wasn't very sought after and is now able to turn that into a profit.
So you're able to sell most of your animals or market them directly to the consumer. I know you said earlier you went to the farmer's market and word of mouth. Is that the only way you built that consumer base or customer base up? And what do you do to keep it going for you or to increase it as needed?
When I originally started, it was Kijiji, which is kind of like Craigslist. I just kind of posted, I have local meat available, and some people would contact me and they come visit the farm, and then they would see that. And then I also had a Facebook page, and then I made a website, and then I got more people coming and visiting and then buying, and essentially the relationship developed like that with your customers. And like it's an ongoing relationship, especially with customers that buy whole halves and quarters. I have a better relationship with them than people that buy retail cuts. They're less likely to come back than someone that's putting a bigger investment into a bigger animal.
You built that relationship. Are there things you're doing ongoing? Like, do you email them, or how do you stay in contact, or do they just contact you when they need more beef or more whatever?
Yeah, so with most people, I keep in contact either with email or with text. So a lot of people, I'll just, they'll text me and I'll send them updates on the animals or send them pictures, or they'll come out to the farm once a year to visit the animals during the summer, or it depends how far they are from the farm. Sometimes they're a bit further, so they don't want to come out too many times, but they'll be here once at least. And then that's kind of, they see the animals, they see the environment, and they're happy with how their animals are raised, and they're confident in my capabilities of bringing them a quality product. So that's kind of how that starts. And then, we just kind of keep in touch.
Yes. And I think that on the farm visitation, getting them out there, seeing your practices, seeing your animal husbandry, they want to support things that they believe in. Exactly. So getting them out there really helps. And that's something as I look towards the future and what I want to do with grass-fed meats. I want to get people out here on the farm, see what we're doing, and I mentioned this before, our guests have mentioned it before, more and more kids, they don't talk about their grandparents' farm because their grandparents have lived in town that long. We're just getting further and further removed, so it's important to get people out and build that relationship.
For sure. Like there's a lot of, even around here, people don't understand that for a cow to make milk, she has to have a calf.
Oh, yes.
Or meat comes from an animal, that it's harvested from an animal. And it's really sad that that's where we're at now. It's so far removed. And it's hard for us because we grow up knowing this. And it's totally an alien idea for a lot of people these days.
Oh, yes. One thing you mentioned was like if they purchase a whole animal or a half or even a quarter, are you selling pigs and goats the same way?
Yeah, so the beef we do whole, half, quarter, and then pigs we do whole, half, and then the goats we only do whole because they're only so big, and if you have them, you really don't have that much. So we only do whole goats.
Do you find you have a good market for goat meat?
We have, yeah. So far, slow growing because I've only had them for 3 years. I've been doing my best marketing, and it's still a work in progress. But so far, we've had pretty good success with selling them. So we sell them, like I said, we sell them whole, and we sell the retail cuts as well.
You're using boar goats.
Yes, boar goats. If you think of a boar goat, a lot of people think like a feedlot animal. They eat grain, you raise them like that. But originally, I wanted to get Kiko goats, which were raised in a system that I find is like ideal, right? You want low input, high output.
Yes.
And so I had originally spoken to Garrett Batten. He's the developer of the Kiko breed. Unfortunately, there was not many Kikos available in our area in Canada.
Yes.
At that time. And for me, it was really important as well that they came from biosecure and tested herds. And there just wasn't the availability for that. So what I ended up doing is taking boar goats from a breeder that did follow similar ideology of like how the animals should be raised. Like you only pick your best growing animals and et cetera, et cetera. And so now I run those boar goats like Kiko goats. So we do the same, we weigh them at birth, we weigh them at weaning, we weigh them at finishing. And then, so what I call it's buck testing. So I have all my bucks, they're all raised in the same conditions. They're all run together in that goat tractor. And,
oh, yes.
At the end of the season, I take my best growing animals and either retain them or I sell those as breeding stock, and anything that doesn't meet my criteria, it is sold for meat. So it's a good system to make sure that you're only retaining good genetics that perform on grass.
Oh, yes. And are you sticking with the boar goats or are you crossbreeding any?
At this point, we're sticking to boar goats because that's what's around.
Yes.
Eventually, I'd like to import a Kiko buck at some point, or maybe a boar buck, but probably a Kiko buck from the US. But at this point, our border is closed to goats. They just closed it in December 2022. They closed the border.
Oh.
So we can't import. We don't know when we'll be able to import next. So until then, I have to work what we have.
Yes. You'd mentioned AI earlier. Have you considered AI on your goats?
Yes, I have considered AI, and my AI tech, we've spoken, and he was really excited about the idea. The problem is it's very expensive to find. So if I wanted to buy a buck in Canada, I could buy a buck in Canada and just ship them here. It's not that big a deal. But if I want to buy semen, I could buy semen from the States, but at $200 a straw. And then you have the conversion of the dollars. So for me, it's even more expensive. And then you have to ship it, and you have to find a company that it's willing to ship goat semen up into Canada. And then at one point, the cost accumulates too much, and the success of AI in goats is lower than in cattle. So you kind of have to weigh your pros and cons. If I were to do that, I would probably try embryos rather than semen. probably a little bit more successful, but it's in there. We're thinking about it, but it's just at this point, the cost.
Even being in the States for myself, I no longer have registered goats, but I did have registered Kikos for a long time. And I went to the AI school for goats. I planned on doing it. I even purchased a little bit of semen, and it just didn't work out and I didn't get it done. But even when I start figuring it up and I don't have some of those exporting, importing costs that you have, and I can probably get it a little bit cheaper than you can, it's still hard to factor in to make money with it unless you're selling seed stock. And then it makes a difference if there's some specific genetics there. And one thing that I mentioned on the podcast before, marketing is not one of my strong suits, or I don't think it is. And so I haven't done the best towards that end. So I got into the registered Kikos, thought I'd do that a little bit more. I found I didn't. So I sold my registered Kikos, and now I've got some commercial goats. I figure it fits me a little bit better. Maybe at some time in the future when I have more time, that's a possibility. But right now, I think these commercial goats are doing all I need to do right now.
So for me, I decided to go with registered stock just because it's just that one layer more of potential sale that you can reach. So if I make all my calculations on just like meat stock, and then you have your breeding stock on top of that, you have your tested breeding bucks on top of that, it's just you have the potential to sell a better animal at a better price. And so it's just that door is open. So you could do that if you wanted to, but you make the numbers work on your meat animals.
Right. And you mentioned a good point there. You have multiple exit strategies for your animals you're raising. They potentially can be as breeding stock. They potentially could be meat. But you got multiple exit points with that. With my commercial flock, I'm limited on those exit plans for them. They become meat, or that's about what they become. Now, there may be some potential for some replacement does to be sold, but it's not the same market as seed stock or that multiplier level of registered business.
And for me also, like it's less with the goats, it's more with the cattle. Like when you have a registered animal, you have a bit more data on that animal. And so like you have birth weights, you have weaning weights, you kind of have like a set history, and you can kind of plan your breedings based off of that. Obviously, you should always take in consideration how your animal actually performs and not just look at the pedigree. I know that's what Garrett, like when we were speaking, because then he was starting the Kikunui project, because the Kikos in the US, people are going back to breeding with pedigree instead of breeding based on performance. And that defeats the whole purpose of the breed, right? So in my setting here, like how I treat them is performance-based breeding and selection to make sure. But you have that added history of the papers just to make everything easier.
Yeah, a little bit more predictability. And before we dive in a little bit deeper there with your cattle and what you're doing, when you think about your goals for the next few years, where do you see Fossil Ridge Farms going?
Yeah, so I definitely would like to settle more into trying to get that pasture rotation more organized and maybe be able to set up a few more grazing paddocks and just divide it up more. Like we started with one pasture where the cows just used to sit out there, and then we went on to, okay, well, we move them back and forth a bit. And then now we had added a couple more pastures, and, it's a progress, but I would definitely like to see more rotation and just try and help the organic matter grow on that rock and make it more healthier essentially for the soil and the cattle, and produce meat from that. And then just, do my best.
Excellent. I think that journey from set stocking rate or continuous grazing to rotational, if you listen to the experts, they're telling you daily moves or even every 12 hours. Sometimes they talk about even more. For me, I went to grazing school recently, and that's encouraged me to do more frequent moves. But at the same time, you're getting benefit, and I forget what those percentages are. It seems like you get 30% of forage utilization with continuous grazing, and by the time you get to daily moves, you're at 70% of forage utilization, but it's a continuum. So you start improving even when you go to 4 paddocks. It makes a big difference. And you're just working on that continuum and being more efficient with your forage harvest. But you've got to work with what works for you, what works for your farm. And I think sometimes when we talk about daily moves, we scare people off because they're like, how do I have time to do that? I think the most important thing is to get started. Wherever you are, get started. Move your cows a little bit or whatever animal you have, and you'll start noticing a difference. But you don't have to jump off the deep end tomorrow.
If I would have started with the farm I worked at between college and coming home, we did daily moves. He did New Zealand style dairy operations. So we were moving them daily. But his setup was so that like it was easy. You know, he had his paddock set up and you would go in there, you would put a new fence and you wouldn't take the old one off and they would just keep going. And it was set up for it, but you have to work with what you have. Like if I would have tried to do that at the beginning, I don't think it would have been very successful because it's just, you weren't set up. I didn't have the knowledge for doing it. And you kind of have to work with the ground you have too. Like
yes.
My soil, my Bedrock ridge here is not going to allow daily moves. And then that's the other thing you have to consider. You can't just switch between doing daily moves and then leaving them a bunch of times and then doing daily. You kind of have to stay consistent because the way the bacteria in the rumen are, you don't want to always introduce a different kind of feed to them, right? You kind of want to keep whatever's going on consistent. So that's important too, because I guess there is such a thing as starving in plentiful. So if you move an animal from one feed to a different feed and the gut bacteria had no chance to adjust to it, you know, they can starve even though they have a field full of grass, you know, because the bacteria aren't there yet.
Well, Claudia, it is time we transition to our overgrazing section. And in our overgrazing section, I think we're going to talk about some Limousin.
Yeah. So I would like to talk about full-blood Limousin cattle. The Limousin is a continental breed. It comes from France. So other continental breeds you might be familiar with are the Charolais, Simmental, Blanc d'Aquitaine, Montbéliard. Those are continental breeds. And then your Angus are British breeds, right? So back in 1968 is when the first Limousin bull was imported to North America and he came to Canada. So a full blood essentially means that animal has 100% bloodlines coming from the original French stock. So you can trace this animal's history all the way back to the French herd book. A purebred animal will have had at some point different breed introduced into its lineage. So not 100% of it can be traced back. So it'll max out at like 99%. And so the difference these days is that because of the crossbreeding effort to adjust to the North American market, the purebred Limousin is a lot different in phenotype than the full-blood Limousin. If you look at a semen catalog, it's hard to distinguish it from an Angus because they tried so hard to make it into what the commercial processing plants and feedlots wanted, which was Angus-type animals. So they tried really hard. I don't know if they tried on purpose, but they definitely looked like they did to make an Angus.
It drives me crazy when I look at a semen catalog and I have to look at the top of the page to find out what breed I'm looking at.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just crazy to me.
You got 4 big processing plants and they all dictate what kind of animal they want. So all the feedlots are like, okay, well, we want this kind of animal. And so now all the breeders go like, okay, well, we'll make that kind of animal. So they all different breeders. I think the only breeder that doesn't fall into that is probably Herefords. But essentially, like from the commercial breeds, they're all the same kind of type-ish animal. So the limo, the purebred limo looked like an Angus, kind of behaves like an Angus. Like in the European and the French standard for a Limousin or a Limousin in the French, it's a long-bodied animal, so it doesn't have a huge belly. It kind of looks like I don't want to say a wiener dog, but like it kind of looks like a dachshund. It has a long, narrow torso.
If the listeners checks out the YouTube video, you've got a picture of a bull right behind you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can see here, he's got a long torso. So if he was a purebred, he'd probably be that much shorter.
Oh, yeah.
The purebreds, they tend to be a bit shorter and they have a lower hanging belly, which is bigger bellies, essentially more guts to digest grass. But the cool thing about the full blood limo is it has a gene called F94L that makes it a lot more feed efficient than regular cattle. They eat the same amount as an Angus or a Hereford. Like I've had them side by side, and if you work with them, you see them eating, and like they eat the same or less than those cows. Like those other cows, they're just stuffing their face, and they're not making me a bigger calf than the limo is. You know, my limo, she produces me 100-pound calf at birth, and these other ones, they'll give me a 60-pound calf, you know, and then the gene, what it does, it creates a more tender meat. So the meat itself is less hard to cut through. So they did shear tests and it's just more tender. And they have more muscle, right? So it's kind of like a double muscle gene. Their muscles grow big. And the thing is, the full bloods, they are 94% of them are homozygous for this gene. And the purebreds are only 60% have the gene at all. So
oh, wow.
And this gene, you do have an effect when you have one copy, but you really see it when you have two copies of it. So you only really see it in full blown effect when you have a full blood.
Is that a gene you can do a DNA test to see if it's present? Yes.
So we do DNA tests for that. Like we're pretty much guaranteed that they have it. There's a small chance that they have one of the other double muscling gene.
Yes.
Like the Charolais or like the Belgian Blue have that causes trouble. Unlike those, this myostatin gene does not cause birthing difficulties. So the calf is born normal. And then when it starts to grow, that's when it kicks in and kind of helps them develop that bigger muscle.
Now, is that F94L gene in the same loci as the double muscling gene, or is that a...
Yes, exactly. So you can't have that gene and then another double muscling gene. I know it's like QXL or something. I don't know.
Oh, yes.
There's two other main genes that are like that. They're on the same one. So you can't have the two copies of the F94L, and then you can't have another copy of the other one. It's either you got both of those, you got a mix of them, or you don't have any at all.
Oh, okay.
So Limousins are known as the carcass breed. So when you go to slaughter them, they have the nicest carcass out of all breeds. And this is especially important for me because I do direct to consumer. I want as much meat as possible off that animal. So my customer has as much meat from that animal because we pay hanging weight.
And I think you said, but you finish your Limousins on grass?
So they're all obviously grass fed. And the way we do it, right? So we calve in February, which is like minus 20 degrees. You know, it's a cold time of the year. So we calve them then. And then so we keep them for a year and a half. They're born the 1 year. And then in the second year, around August, September, that's when we go to process them. So we don't have to keep them through a second winter. It gives us like the biggest growth range that we can manage for our area up here.
Now, during the winter, are you just feeding them hay, or are they get anything else?
So yeah, we do silage bales. We usually aim for hay.
Yes.
But if the weather isn't right, we don't want the quality to go down, so we'll just wrap it. If the weather suddenly changes and it's going to rain on it, like we'll just wrap it and make sure that we keep that quality. We don't want to grade any quality of the hay that we have.
Before we finish up with the overgrazing section, you have any last words you'd like to add?
The limos are a bit of a bigger animal than what most people have here as a grazing animal. And I know a lot of people, they're probably like, geez, you're feeding a big animal for nothing. But the limo really, it's because of its feed efficiency, and despite, that it's a big animal, it's still an easy animal to work with. So, they're pretty docile, and that's something they took it to heart, because I think at the beginning when they came here in the 80s or so, they were considered like crazy animals. But the breed associations really took that to heart and made sure that when you register your animals, that you have to fill out a behavior score. So you have to score your animal. Is she crazy? Will she try to kill you? Or she's super docile? So that, you only keep animals that are nice and docile, and which is really important because a calm animal is a safe animal. If you have a crazy animal or an aggressive cow, not only is she a danger to you, but she's going to stress out the entire herd. As soon as you get rid of that one cow, your whole herd's going to calm down. So it's
Yes.
really nice that they're very nice and easy, docile cattle to work with, despite being a big animal.
You mentioned a couple of things there, Claudia. One, a bigger animal. It's a little bit bigger. Where I'm located in Oklahoma, I'm working on having a little bit smaller animal. But one thing I think about is as you go north and the climate gets colder, the mammals, the wild mammals, have larger bodies. So to me, that makes some sense there that you would have a larger animal in Canada. Now, I say that every operation's different, and you got to find out what works for you. So I think that's probably the most important thing, is figuring out what works for you and your market. If you don't have something you can market, you got problems. And then secondly, my grandpa purchased some full-blood Limousins decades ago, and they were crazy. And that was an issue my dad and I really focused on, was docility. And when we purchased full-blood Limousin bulls, we made sure to pick bulls that were really good on that temperament. And it made a tremendous difference on our herd. I was amazed by the progress. And I have the advantage, I can look at my dad's herd and I can look at my grandpa's herd. And my grandpa's herd, I still don't understand. He's 96 and shouldn't be out there with them because they're a little crazy. But our herd, he could come out with our herd and wouldn't be a problem because we made that a point of emphasis. I noticed when we were looking for bulls in Limousin, we're moving a little ways away from that with Dad's herd. But when we were looking for bulls, full-blood Limousin bulls, the bulls we looked at were really calm, and then we made an emphasis of it and made a big difference.
The behavior is 70% inheritable.
Oh, yes.
So if you have a calm animal, you're 70% likely that his offspring will also be calm. So it's easy to breed in, guys. It's not that hard. If you keep a crazy animal, you're going to have a crazy calf. Yeah. If you keep a calm animal, you're going to have a calm calf. So it's very heritable. And I've noticed this with my bull too. I had to look around when I wanted a bull. And then I saw this guy and I was like, I went to see him. And I'm like, this is the calmest bull I have ever met in my entire life.
Yes.
And I've been around a lot of bulls in my life. And, I was like, that's the animal I want. And so that's what we got. And then the other thing was, with the larger cows, for us, we want bigger calves. So my preferred calf size is around 100 pounds. And because it's cold here when we calve in the winter, it's -20. You have a 100-pound calf and they hit the ground running. It's like the cold doesn't even affect them. As soon as they're dried off, they're fine. And then the thing is, when we have the Angus or the Angus crossbred animals and they have these smaller calves, like 60 pounds, 70 pounds, they're always cold. They're just not as hardy from the beginning. They just have to work that much harder to get where that 100-pound calf is. And they just fall behind. And we prefer the larger animals. And I know a lot of people are probably like, damn, 100-pound calf. But if you look at it this way, 1,000-pound cow should be able to have a calf that's 10% of her weight, which is 100 pounds. So your Angus cows should be able to have 100-pound calves. It's just there's been this huge emphasis on birth weights, low birth weights over these last few years that everybody's now scared of a 100-pound calf, which is normal. Like in theory, my 1,500-pound cow should be able to have a 150-pound calf, but 100 pounds is ideal for me.
Very good, Claudia. Claudia, it's time we move to our famous 4 questions. Same 4 questions we ask of all of our guests. Our first question: what is your favorite grazing grass related book or resource?
Yes. So my favorite resource is YouTube. I'm not a big reader, and there's only when you buy a book, you have your information in there. But when you go on YouTube and you're like, I have this very specific problem or question, you type it in there, and usually you have a couple of answers or a couple of different ways of fixing that problem or explanations or whatnot. So it's nice to have a variety, and it's a variety of people you can find to help you with that solution.
I am a reader, but I do love my YouTube channels, and I have a certain set of channels that I watch each week, and usually Saturday and Sunday morning when I get up before everyone else is up, I go through my YouTube channels and catch up on what's going. Do you have some favorite YouTube channels that you watch?
Obviously, Just a Few Acres, Pete. Then there's, I think it's called Heifer USA. They have some interesting stuff too. There's a few others, but I can recall them off the top of my head. I think there's Sheraton Park Farms.
Our second question, what is your favorite tool on the farm, or what tool could you not live without on the farm?
My go-to would be my gator or tractor, because I use that every day. Obviously the fencer, because we only run like electric, but if I had like, I think that's a pretty standard thing. If you have livestock, you have a fence. It doesn't really, I don't think you can count it because you have to have it. But so definitely like the gator or the tractor, because they're my workhorses.
Very good. And our third question, what would you tell someone just getting started?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of good advice given by many different people, and I haven't heard this one yet. So I'm going to say, take into consideration farm safety. Farms are dangerous.
They are.
There's a lot of things that can go wrong if you're not paying attention, if you're not being careful, if you're rushing to get something done. There's always a possibility of injury or death. And, I don't have a shortage of stories of people getting injured. And especially, I want to say, either you've grown up on a farm and you already notice stuff and you need a reminder, or you're just starting into it. You never been on a farm, or you grew up in the city and you haven't been exposed to the dangers, and then you come and you don't realize that, a PTO or an angry mama is a danger.
Oh, yes.
And so, and like, especially like when you have kids too, it's important to step up your farm safety even more, because I've seen a lot. Like, unfortunately, just last year we had a child. He was run over by a bobcat because he was riding in the bucket, and then they hit a bump and he fell out and he got run over. And then we also had a situation last year where a new farmer purchased a tractor, and he had gotten caught in the PTO because he didn't turn it off when he went to go.
Oh, no.
And one of my teachers in college, he said this: there's no such thing as an accident, because accidents can all be prevented. If you take a moment, you're like, oh, if I turn the PTO off, then this is going to be, if you turn the tractor off, then the clutch can't slip. Go check on your bale spear if it's actually locked when you put it onto your front loader, things like that. When you're working with cattle or even sheep can be dangerous. If a ram butts you in the head, you're probably going to have a cracked skull. Like, there's danger around every corner. You just have to make sure that you're aware of what's going on and not put yourself at risk.
I completely agree. And sadly, as you talk about those farm stories, I think about farm stories here, people I know, things that's happened to my parents, to myself. Farm safety, take just a moment, think about what you're doing. Don't be in a hurry. You want to take your time and just make sure you're doing it deliberately and know what you're doing. And if you're not sure, shut all the moving parts down. There's no reason to get out there among them.
And if you're really unsure of what you're doing, like, ask for help. Find someone that knows what they're doing. If you're trying to treat a cow and you have no idea what you're doing, call a vet. They have drugs that'll persuade the animal. Not, don't use your physical strength. You'll never win against an animal. They're stronger
you will
than
not.
You are.
And just like you mentioned the sheep, oh man, sheep can be crazy. And you think you can handle them, but they can be quite...
They're strong.
They are.
Pound for pound, animals are much stronger than we are. So I've been run over by a goat. it happens.
And Claudia, our last question is, where can others find out more about you?
Yes. So we have a website, fossilridgefarms.ca, CA for Canada. We also have a Facebook page and an Instagram by the same name, Fossil Ridge Farms. Have a YouTube channel with a couple of videos, but nothing too crazy, just some videos of the animals.
Very good. Claudia, we really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You're listening to the Grazing Grass Podcast, helping grass farmers learn from grass farmers. And every episode features a grass farmer and their operation. If you've enjoyed today's episode and want to keep the conversation going, visit our community at community.grazinggrass.com. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to the Grazing Grass Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube for past and future episodes. We also welcome guests to share about their own grass farming journey. So if you're interested, fill out the form on grazinggrass.com under the Be Our Guest link. Until next time, keep on grazing grass.